Hello chess friends and welcome to you out of chess channel and welcome to our little computer chess world. Welcome to a new game that was played by top engines, and today we're continuing our series in a very tricky opening that we have covered yesterday here on my YouTube chess channel. We have covered a great game played by Stockfish 14 in the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian. Today we're continuing our Pelikan Lasker Sicilian because you requested in several comments that you wanted me to continue to follow this very nice opening, because especially because Magnus Carlsen is also playing this opening very often. He played that opening, for instance, in the 2018 World Chess Championship against Fabiano Caruana many times with great success. He didn't lose any games in the Lasker-Pelikan Sicilian. He won also several games with the black pieces, so that's why, as I said, it's something worth to study. But in order to understand, of course, what's going on the board, we have to also analyze the game from black's perspective but also from white's perspective, and that's why I decided to continue now the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian with a great game played by Stockfish now, but from white's perspective. Yesterday, as I said, we had a great game in the Pelikan Lasker from black's perspective. Now we're analyzing a little bit more the strategical and tactical ideas here for white. And be prepared, this is again a tricky Stockfish stuff all over the board, and I really liked here Stockfish approach, how Stockfish didn't rush into the attack. Stockfish played first the great positional struggle, sort of tried to improve first the minor pieces on the board, never really rushed into the attack, never pushed a pawn carelessly or something, just waited for the moment when it was time to make progress. That's why I decided to show you this game. It was a brilliant game played by the fish against another top engine, Houdini. So let's check out now the game. We're analyzing, of course, a little bit also the opening analysis, so we're also searching for good silence. So that's why I think in the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian we'll cover many top engine games. So here e4 played by Stockfish. We have now c5 by Houdini, knight to f3, knight to c6, and we have now d4, the open Sicilian. So here c takes d4, knight to d4, and as I said, the great thing about the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian that we have also talked about yesterday is this move knight to f6, because we're not showing our cards. That's, I think, the beauty of the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian, because we're not playing g6, we're not playing e6, d6, a6, we're not playing another pawn move. We have only played once with the pawn, and now we have played twice with the knight. That's the beauty, and we're waiting now, of course, white to play it here, the move knight to c3, because after move knight to c3 we can now gain a tempo. But of course, in the main positional problem of blacks is, of course, the weak d6 square. So that's why here d6 has to be played, and again now white has several choices. We will analyze in the continuation of the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian also this popular line with bishop to g5. Bishop to g5 would be, in my opinion, a natural idea, because we have now a little bit a strange position for black when it comes to pawn structures. We have now this backward pawn on d6 and also a weak square on d5. Also, we have to notice the f5 is a strategical point that maybe white can occupy. Also the f5 square is a weakness. So that's why here with this idea bishop to g5, what we want to do is, of course, get a positional trade of pieces. What I mean about that, one of the best ways to create the strategy against an isolated pawn or a backward pawn here, like black is in the position, is to create a blockade in front of that pawn. So it means we want to occupy the d5 square. So that's why the pinning idea would be a natural idea, because we're getting rid of the key defender of the d5 square. So we would then simply continue our pressure around the square d5. So we'll analyze also in the continuation of the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian these types of ideas. So, but here after move d6, also a very popular idea by white can be this move, knight to d5, which is now a clarification immediately in the central, because black has to react. Black has to take knight to d5, because also knight to c7 is now a huge opportunity. You can maybe try something else, but this wouldn't be, I think, a good idea. So that's why knight takes d5 is simply the best continuation. After knight to d5, we have now e takes d5, and what we can notice now, okay, white got a tempo in these types of positions, but the problem is now you cannot anymore battle for the d5 square. You have taken over here, you have occupied the d5 square with your pawn, but the pawn structure is really static. Which I mean about this is, of course, that the pawns are blocked. We cannot attack anymore further. The d6 weakness, all of the d6 is a long-term weakness, but so far it's not easy to attack the position immediately. So after move d5, e takes d5, again black has, I think, two choices, knight to b8 and knight to e7. Here in this game, knight to e7 was played by Houdini. In my opinion, knight to b8 is much stronger. We have analyzed now the game from black's perspective yesterday, played by Stockfish in this particular line, knight to b8, then with ideas knight to d7, then bishop to e7, f5, and maybe knight to f6, bringing this knight on a good square here on f6, which would be actually the normal square for the knight. So here, after move knight to e7, we can say again very important things about this knight. This knight will not stay there forever, so the knight has to be maneuvered to g6 and to f5. So that's why here c4 is the normal idea of white. White waits now the move, and again we have now knight to f5 here played by Houdini. So it's knight to f5 seems in the beginning that it's a good move because you can occupy in long terms, of course, with maybe a6 moves and maybe knight to d4, you can occupy the weak d4 square, but actually it's not so easy to occupy the square. Still the knight cannot be kicked away in a different way. We'll come to that point in the later stage of the game. But after move knight to f5, we can, I think, notice one important thing. The main strength of the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian that we have talked about also yesterday is this pawn majority with 4 versus 3 pawns on the king side. Of course, white has also his fun here with this 3 versus 2 situation on the queen side. So that's why using the pawn majority attacks is actually the main strategy for both sides. So with the move knight to f5 here, that's the main issue. I think the knight has taken a natural square for the pawn. The pawn has to be on f5, and then we can create maybe some further madness with f4, e4, and similar stuff. So far you need to move another time with your knight in order to maybe finally push the pawn on f5. Here, if you try a knight to g6, let's see also a little bit this analysis. Knight to g6 leads now into a complicated line because I think we can immediately attack the pawn here with the knight with the move h4, and black would be pretty much forced to play the move h5, because if you take knight to h4, it leads now into a really complicated game because you can play now this one, rook to h4. If you take of course the rook, then of course we have this idea, knight to c7, the fork on the king and the rook. So that's why you would be forced first to kick away the knight, but still the game is very complicated after this move bishop to g5, because if you take queen takes g5, then you get knight to c7 anyway. You have to play king to d8. We can play then rook to h5. You see, first in the intermezzo attacking the queen. Queen to g6 would be pretty much forced, because now if we take, of course, bishop to g4 can happen, but still we can cover with bishop to e2. You take bishop to h5, and here white is much better because white is staying now in the game with an extra piece. So this is really a wild continuation. Knight to h4 would be a mistake. Maybe here after rook to h4, a6, bishop to g5, f6 is an opportunity to attack both now of these minor pieces, but still with knight to d6, bishop to d6 or queen to d6, we can play bishop to d2, simply retreating. And I like really more white position, although the material is equal, but this king is a little bit endangered. I think if you castle too early, you see the h7 is a weakness, bishop to d3 will happen. Here queen to h5 is an opportunity. Even b4 c5 will come very fast here in the continuation of the game. So that's why I think white is much better, because although black in this position has really a pawn majority, but it's harder, I think, for black to push these pawns in front of the king, because if you push f5, g5 and similar stuff, then you weaken the pawn structure in front of the king too much. So that's why, in my opinion, this is not a good continuation. So after move c4 here and a potential knight to g6 here after h4, black is pretty much forced to play the move h5, and now we reach probably this continuation that was also played by Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen. We reach now this position, queen to a4, with this direct threat to play this discovered attack with the move knight to d6. So that's why here bishop to d7 would be a forced line, and now after queen to b4, black has a great way to defend this position with the move queen to b8, and that was exactly one game here. I see in the database Magnus Carlsen won the game in 2018 here in this particular line here from black's perspective. We're analyzing, of course, also some games played by the world champion Magnus Carlsen in the continuation of our Pelikan Lasker Sicilian stuff. So as I said, this will be also a cornerstone of this particular line. The problem about this line, we can say, I think, that the move h5 weakens a little bit the pawn structure, because bishop to e2 and maybe queen to d1 can create some damage on the king side. But as I said, we'll analyze this line in the continuation of the series. So that were some analysis after move c4 and knight, potential knight to g6. Here in the continuation, Houdini, as we said, played the move knight to f5. Here bishop to d3, attacking simply the knight. We have bishop to e7, and now castling played by Stockfish. We have now a6 and now knight to c3. Knight to c3 is very important now. In some occasions you could maybe try here to move knight to a3, but I kind of like more this ideas with, okay, you can play maybe knight to c2, maybe knight to e3, but still I kind of like this idea when you have the opportunity to push this pawn on the a file very fast, because with a4 a5 we could actually paralyze a little bit further the queen side, because it's obvious that of course with the move a6, okay, the knight got kicked away, but still the b6 c7 and also the a5, we have to notice, I think, are weak squares in black's position. So that's why after move a6, normal stuff, knight to c3, we have now g6, and you see now it is, as we talked yesterday about this position, it is a similar structure like in the King's Indian, but I simply don't like anymore this knight on f5. You see, the knight has taken really an important square for the pawn. The pawn has to be there, not the knight. The knight has to be somewhere here, maybe on d4, but still you see now how, as I promised you, you see how Stockfish will battle against this outpost knight on d4, which will be, I think, a very cool strategy here played by the fish, because fish played here immediately the move f4, undermining the main pawn that could maybe protect here the knight on d4. So here in the continuation castling played by Houdini, if you try knight to d4 immediately, it's not so good, because you get simply this one, f takes e5, d takes e5, and now I think with bishop to h6 we can prevent now black from castling. That's the main issue. So that's why after move f4, here Houdini castles, and now king to h1, simply getting out of the attack, because in some occasions maybe queen to b6 could be a dangerous move. That's why first securing the king by Stockfish was, I think, a great idea. So here b5 played by Houdini, again challenging simply the pawn majority that white has on the queen side. We have talked about the strategies in the beginning, so it's obvious that white has here a dominant position on the queen side. But again, if you try knight to d4 immediately, I've analyzed this line because I was really asking myself this question, why is black not jumping on this square? Because again, you get this undermining pressure idea. F takes e5, d takes e5 is of course a must move, and now with bishop to h6, rook to e8, knight to e4 is a very tricky move, because you have to play sort of a blockade idea, and you have to play in one particular moment, I think, also the move bishop to d6, then knight to e4 would be very dangerous. So as I said, it's not so good here immediately to play this position like this, to occupy the d4 square, because this undermining pressure idea, you see, you haven't developed your dark square bishop still in the continuation of the game. The bishop will come on h6. Now I think with queen to e1 we can even sneak in here queen to g3 and similar stuff. Queen to f2 also is very dangerous, maybe to attack the position around the square f7. Now the e5 is even hanging, you have to play bishop to d6, as we said, to protect it. Now knight to e4 is a must move, I think, here for white. You see how this knight fits simply in the position, attacks simply the dark square bishop, c5, d6, knight to f6 are opportunities. So really brilliant game for white in my opinion. So here after move king to h1, as said, Houdini didn't play this outpost knight to d4, played simply here the move b5. We have now b3. Again, as I promised you in the beginning, Stockfish is not rushing here, although probably c takes b5 is an opportunity. Nothing wrong with this move. After a takes b5, knight to b5 is also not a problem. I think white is much better. But okay, here Stockfish tried to hang on to this position, because if b takes c4 happens, now still b takes c4, nothing wrong, because still we have opportunities to play here again f takes e5. Let's see possible continuation. You try again this move knight to d4, again simply f takes e5. We have again d takes e5, again bishop to h6, we see queen to e1, queen to f2, and again knight to e4, c5, d6. Now it's even worse, because I think the position gets more and more cleared, and I think with these two connected pawns on the c file and the d file, white is much better. So here after move b3, finally this move knight to d4 e4, but it was a little bit different move order. We have now c takes b5, we have bishop to f6. Here Houdini tried at least to bring this bishop into the game, aiming also against this rook on a1, tried maybe to create some dynamics. Here in the continuation we have now b takes a6, bishop to a6, bishop takes rook to a6, and now after move rook to b1, Stockfish gets all of the potential range of the dark square bishop and has now simply two pawns connected on the queen side, which is now of course a great endgame. The engine gives here already +1 evaluation for white, although this outputs the knight on d4 is very good. Of course the bishop on f6 is now a good piece, but you have lost the pawn, and white has now two connected pawns. That's, I think, now something that white can hang on to this position and can simply go into a favorable endgame. So it's not a good continuation simply here for black. So here rook to a8, we have a4. Here Stockfish simply continues to push the pawn on the queen side. We have bishop to g7. If you try e takes f4, nothing wrong with this move. Bishop to f4, you haven't really improved the position here in the center of the board. Now the knight is even loose on the board, and the problem is with the move king to h1, you cannot even attack white king further in the continuation. So here after move b4, we have now bishop to g7. Stockfish simply proceeds to push here. We have e4, rook to e1, we have now rook to c8, because knight to e4 wouldn't be such a good position. It seems that you can take the pawn on e4, but actually it's not so good because you get a very tricky line that black was preparing here. You probably reach now a drawish position, because after knight to c2 you have to play rook to e2 in order to protect your knight on e4, and then black can do this perpetual attack of the rook again with the knight to c2. Wherever you move again, black will simply continue the pressure against the rook, and the game would lead into draw. Rook to e4 is of course not an opportunity because you simply lose the knight. So that's why after move rook to c8, we have now bishop to d2 played by Stockfish, and now e3 played by Houdini. A tricky idea, because after rook to e3, we have now bishop to e3, and okay, it seems so. If rook takes c3, bishop to d4 happens, then of course white is much better. But Houdini had a great line in mind here with the move knight to f5, double attack, because now the bishop is hanging, but also the knight on c3 is hanging. But don't worry, you know that Stockfish calculates everything, and Stockfish calculated this position very well, because Stockfish actually sacrificed one piece, played simply bishop to d2. We have now bishop to c3, bishop takes c3, rook to c3, but now simply this knight is too far away from the action. Now these two connected pawns are simply too much to handle here for black. So Stockfish simply proceeds with b6, queen to b8, a5. We have now rook to a3, queen to e1, of course protecting first these two connected pawns. We have now queen to b7. We have now queen to c1 attacking this pawn. Here Houdini took, but now this is the main issue here, queen to c6. You have to protect now somehow the queen. If you move of course the queen to b8, then we simply continue with b7, and it's simply game over. So that's why here after move queen to c6, rook to a7 here played by Houdini. Here Stockfish simply proceeds with rook to c1. Again, if you take, of course it's not so good. You get simply this one, d takes c6, and two pawns get connected. If you try something like this, we can still play like this, and you have to take, and we can now promote the queen, and it would be game over. So here after move rook to c1, Houdini tried h6. We have queen to c8, the check, a couple of checks, and simply takes the rook, and now queen to b2. This is now of course a completely winning endgame for Stockfish. We have rook to c8, knight to g7, h3, now simply getting the pieces more active. King to g1, we have now queen to f2, and now after queen takes f4, g takes f4, Stockfish has now reached the full endgame stage, and now it's obvious that this should be winning, because this d6 is a weakness. All of these pawns are isolated, so they are really clear objects of white's attack. So here rook to d8, knight to f5. We have now of course some king moves. The king is marching towards the center, and now after king to e3, knight to g3, again some attacks. g4, the knight has to move. We have king to g3, again knight to g6, but now finally Stockfish grabs a pawn. We have now king to e6, h4, now rook to h5, king to e7. Now the rook changes the direction of the attack. Rook to a8, f5, g takes f5. We have king to f6, rook to a6 attacking the pawn, knight to c4, king to f4, king to g7, check, simply pushing this pawn further. We have now king to e3, knight to b4, and after h7, king to f5. In this position, Houdini resigns. So Brilliant game again by the Fish. I'm really interested to continue now this Pelikan Lasker Sicilian, because in my opinion these are really in the beginning some great positional games, but then the game becomes really wild and tactical, and I think there are many unexplored lines that we should cover, because in my opinion against E4 you face many times the Pelikan Lasker Sicilian, and in my opinion if you have trouble maybe to find a good opening against E4, you can choose to play it, because in my opinion it's a decent and sharp opening. You can have great counterplays, especially because in the continuation of the series I'll try to find more and more Stockfish games, and we're analyzing them, and with different sidelines, of course, with different possibilities in the continuation in the middle game stage, especially with some end game strategies like this. We have also this 2 connected pawns here, so as I said, I think it will be a fun series, so I think it's something worth a study. So again, thank you for the suggestion. Many of you suggested to me to continue this Pelikan Lasker Sicilian. I will try as hard as I can. I will try to show you more and more games in this tricky opening, so as I said, it will be a fun series for sure. So okay, if you have trouble maybe to play so far as black, check out my hyper accelerated ranked Sicilian defense series and my Nxd4 defense series as good responses to D4 and E4. And if you want to see maybe some more Stockfish stuff and maybe some other chess games played by computer, check out my commented chess games played by chess engines. Here's the series of here's the playlist of our whole series, and if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.